Welcome to another episode of the Trailblazers Experience Podcast, the podcast where we have candid conversations with women sharing their career journeys. Today's guest is a multi-hyphenate scientist, vintner, author, and change maker, and really a trailblazer. I'm joined by a fourth-generation Argentinian winemaker, Stanford-trained emergency physician, author of 3 acclaimed books, and founder of the Catena Institute of Wine. She's MD of the world-renowned, if you don't know about it, Google it, Catena Sabata, as well as creator of Luca Wines and Domaine Nico. I'm reading here something that was described by doing the research that Laura's leadership has been shaped the global perception of Argentinian wine and earned accolades across science, sustainability, and storytelling. And she has a few Michelin star wines as well. I think Angelica is one of them, which is, really renowned within the restaurant industry as well. So Laura, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Ntola.
It's so amazing.
I feel shy right now. You make me sound so amazing.
Well, you know what? We have to give you your flowers, and praise you now for all the things that you've done. So it's a bit of a pat of the back for Dr. Laura Catena. So it's really important to sometimes to reflect on all the stuff that you've done, isn't it? It's things that you've built over your career. And now you can read through and say, oh my goodness, it was worth it, actually.
Yeah, well, I have done a lot of amazing things, but honestly, nothing would be possible without all these people in Argentina, our team at the winery who work so hard. They're so amazing. Yesterday we were having a meeting with all the vineyard people and we were talking about how we're preserving these genetically diverse vines, and it was so technical and they know so much. And I was thinking, wow, these young people, they know so much, they work so hard. And, I was kind of thinking that you read all these things about these new generations that they don't like this and they don't like that. And I was looking at these young people who were incredible. I don't know. I just had this moment just yesterday watching people at the winery talk about their work in the vineyard, in preserving the natural world, in making wines that speak of a place, in preserving our traditions. And it was such a beautiful thing. And it made me think, wow, all this work has been worth it, because if these young people at our winery are so passionate about what they're doing, we're doing something right.
You know what? I mean, your winery has been around, 123 years?
Yeah. Since 1902, my great-grandfather came from Italy. And I sometimes think of myself as 6th generation because there were 2 generations in Italy before Argentina. And 1902 were the first vines from my great-grandfather, Nicola Catena, from Le Marche in Italy.
I mean, that is amazing. You've talked about it. So it does take a village in a way. So when you talk about everyone who's in the winery, it's a community, it's a family, and all the dots that are joined together is what makes it what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's very easy to sit there and fantasize about all the things you want to do. But, today more than ever, I am very aware that every idea is going to require so much work. And, you just have to make sure that you're not dreaming too much, which maybe that's depressing, but, you can't get everything done that you dream of. So you have to pick a few things and do them really well. And that's, I think, perhaps the winning strategy that's worked for me.
So let's talk about your career, because it's beautifully complex. Progress is not linear. You started off with medicine. So let's literally go all the way back as to what prompted you, to say, actually, I want to go into the medical profession. And then we can talk about the weave that has been winemaking, research, being an author. What have been some pivotal moments that really shaped your career?
Yes. Well, when I was in university, I loved science, but I also loved humanities. And I knew I wanted to do work with people. I tried actually working in a science lab, and I was a bit bored because, it was just all day inside the lab doing technical things. And I thought, I need to be with people. I need to be talking. And so I thought, okay, doctor, this is great because I can help people. I really wanted to do something to help others, to help the world. And I got to use my science and I got to be with people. And I thought that was exactly the kind of thing I wanted to do. And I actually really enjoyed being a doctor for 27 years. So I think I made the right choice. But what's interesting is that I had no concept in my head that making wine actually would have all the same characteristics, because wine is coming from the earth, it's maintaining communities, it gives joy when drunk in moderation and pleasure. And, it even has some associations with health benefits and some harms, but there's definitely some benefits in the literature. We can talk about that later. This is a big project of mine right now. I have a website, indefenseofwine.com, explaining all the science behind wine and health. And so actually today, I think that making wine, I am using science. I'm working with people. I am spreading love, helping people, I think, to enjoy life, which in the end is one of our goals, or it should be at least enjoying the moment, which I think wine really does help us enjoy a meal. It helps us relax, have an enhanced experience with friends and family, as long as we don't drink too much. That's the key. But back then, I didn't think that wine was a career that was going to accomplish these goals that I had. And I think that's quite common, when you're young. Also, you think of anything that's a business as bad, or at least I did. My children are, I think, maybe not less idealistic, but they're more practical. They understand that actually you need to make money to be able to do the things you want to do, to go on vacations, support your family. At that time in my life, I thought anything that is focused on making money, like a business, I don't want anything to do with that. I want to be a doctor and help people. But, doctors need to get paid too. And hospitals run on money and money has to be made. So at that time, though, I thought that anything that was a business was maybe not something I was interested in.
You were in your ideology, isn't it, of what the world is and what your values and your
Yes,
ethics
yes.
and anything with money. I just want to help. But you're right.
Yeah,
Interesting enough, it is the business of medicine, isn't it? And
yeah,
if you're not paid well, you can't concentrate, you're not able to
yeah,
do a good job, which is
yeah.
why, probably a lot of hospitals or institutions that are not having that funding are struggling in third world countries,
Absolutely.
etc. Yeah.
Everywhere. But, I was just in Burgundy at the Hospice de Bonne, which is, this incredible hospital that was founded with auctions of wine. And it's still supported by all these vineyards that have been donated by people. And they have this amazing hospital in this, rather small part of France that is supported by wine. And I think that's such a beautiful thing, and it was created hundreds of years ago. So yeah, I think there are good ways to make your money and spend your money. And I've changed my mind about that now that I'm quite a bit older.
So what was the pivotal point for you to say, right, I've done all that I can in my medical profession, I've achieved what I need to achieve, for you to now say, actually, I want to step back into the family business? And it's a change, isn't it? It's a career
Yeah.
change, isn't it? Instead of going linear, you're going elsewhere.
Yeah.
What was that decision point for
Well,
you?
actually, I worked for 25 years. Most of my medical career, I was also working in wine. So this started a long time ago, my involvement in the winery. And it was mostly related to helping my father because he was actually very depressed when I told him I would be a doctor because he wanted me to go work with him. And he thought, oh my God, as a doctor, she would never, ever come work with me because she loves being a doctor. But then I think he is one of those people that never give up. And so he said, Laurita, I'm going to France and I have to see what the competition, the top of French wines are doing. And I don't speak French and you speak French because I studied French when I was quite young and I love the French language and French literature and French culture. And so, of course, my papa is asking me to go to France with him. I say yes. So I go to France and I immediately fall in love with wine. Although I was already in love with French literature. I was kind of obsessed with Sartre and Camus growing up as a teenager because, the big existential questions are the questions of that age. And they are still questions that I ask myself. I think those are questions that you never stop asking yourself, the whole existential movement in France. But anyhow, so I go with my father, I fall in love with wine. And then he will ask me, back then, little things like, Laurita, will you go represent us at this wine fair? And I would say, Papa, I have a hospital shift and, I have one day off this week. And he'd say, oh, okay, that's the day. It's Saturday. Perfect. You can go
I could
fly
see
to
what he was doing there.
yeah, exactly. He was like, you can fly to New York and stand behind a little table and represent our winery. And so what happened was that, I got interested in wine, and then I felt bad for my father, who would always say to me, oh, my English is so bad. His English is quite good, but he would say, oh, you have to help us, and I said, okay, wine is really interesting. I have my doctor job. I was an accident and emergency doctor, so I could work shifts. So I said, okay, I will work part-time as a doctor because I'm not stopping being a doctor. I love this. This is my profession I was born to do. But I will start helping a little bit in the winery. So I actually started with research at the Catena Institute. So, studying the soil, the climate, all these things that were very science-based. And, I had a science background. That was something I knew about. I didn't know anything about selling or the word marketing. I remember I didn't understand what the word marketing meant. It sounded kind of like a very horrible word. I still don't like using it because it sounded like pushing people to buy something. And I said to my father, Papa, what does this marketing mean? Is it doing an advertisement? Is it the label? And he said, Laurita, don't worry about that. He said, I tell you, it's very simple. If you make something that is twice as good as your competitors, so, if your 20-pound wine is as good as the 40-pound wines, then you don't need marketing. So number one thing, and honestly, he said this to me, 30 years ago. I can't improve on that. I think that is the number one step,
And that is quality.
over
Focus on the
deliver in
quality of your
quality.
product.
If
Yeah.
you can over deliver in quality, consumers are very smart. They taste the wine. They don't have to be wine experts. Better wines taste better. It really does. People can tell. And so number one thing, and then he did say something that I thought was interesting, which was, try to do things differently. Don't copy other people. And it's very tempting when you start in something. You want to do something like other people. You go to Italy and you say, oh, I love their Super Tuscans. Let's do a wine like that. Or you go to Burgundy and they have the wines from the little Climat, and you say, oh, we need to do that. And it's very tempting to try to copy what other people are doing. After I was doing this for a while, I realized, wow, we don't need to copy. Everything we have is amazing and very different. We have Malbec. Nobody else has, a substantial amount of plantings of Malbec, because in France it was nearly abandoned. We have this high altitude, which is different. We have this culture, which is this mix of Italian and Spanish and Argentinian, which is a mix of, the people who were there before the Europeans came, and they built these canals, and we have this rich culture in Argentina that is unique and different. And in Mendoza, also a different culture than in Buenos Aires, our capital. And so I thought, wow, this is different, and this is what we need to preserve and highlight and talk about. But yeah, I didn't know anything about the whole business side, but I knew about research and science, and I think that was really important because a lot of the work back then had to do with competing with these great producers from around the world, and we were making a lot of wine for the domestic market. But a lot of the wines were blends. They weren't necessarily terroir driven. They were in some areas that maybe were a little too warm. So we did need some science to elevate the quality of our wines. Yeah.
So let's talk about that. I mean, first of all, your dad was a very wise man in terms of talking about, never compromise on quality and authenticity. Those are the things that will market your brand and stand the test of time. You talked about the Catena Institute of Wine, which you launched, back in the early 90s. So what was the motivation for using data and science to elevate, the wine?
Yeah.
And how has that mission evolved? Is it still the same, or are you moving in a different direction?
Yeah. So I would say still our mission is to make Argentine wines that can stand with the best of the world. And that was my father's mission. That's still my mission. I think that will always be our mission, to really elevate our region. So why science? When I first came to wine, the one thing I did not like was that I felt like people would just do a lot of blah, blah, blah. They would say, my wine tastes like this because I have this little rock over here, and look at this, fossil in the soil, and I have this plant here, and that's why I have these floral aromas. And I thought, is that true? And then I started doing research, and I realized that a lot of this was made up stuff, and people were just saying anything to sell a bottle of wine. And I also saw a lot of these flying winemakers that were making the rounds in the 90s. There were these, French, Australian, American that were just coming to new regions and saying, oh, this is how you need to prune. And, this is how you need to plant your vineyard, different methods of planting. And, you have the guyot, you have the vertical trellis, you have the barral. And so they would say, oh, you've always done it this way. Well, now you need to do it in this different way because this is how we do it in France, let's say. But what I realized was that the soil and climate was so different. The varieties are different. The culture. We don't have a big phylloxera problem. Phylloxera is this pest that basically will decimate your vineyard anywhere in the world, except for Argentina and Chile. We don't really know very well why. It's something to do with the climate. So we don't have to graft on American rootstock. So we had so many conditions that were different. And then we had these, flying winemakers telling us to do things in certain ways. And what I realized was that in viticulture, because our product has to represent the place it comes from, it's very different from other things. Most people don't know where the tomatoes they're eating came from. They generally just come from somewhere where it was warm. With wine, people really care. They want to know, what does the wine from this place taste like? And it's not even this place as in a country. It's this particular vineyard parcel. And so I thought that we should do our own research so that we are making the best wines that we can do in our region. And there's a lot of things that have been done by your ancestors a certain way for a reason. So why would somebody coming from some foreign country know something that we don't? And so a lot of the research idea came from, what if we could use science to preserve our nature and our culture? And that is actually the method of the Catena Institute, to use science to preserve nature and culture. And the reason why culture is really important as well is that, the natural world has already been modified by us. A vineyard is, Vitis vinifera coming from the Mediterranean, planted in Argentina. It's not a native species. So now that we've modified our nature and that all this ecosystem has developed around these vineyards that we've planted, from the little foxes to the birds, to the insects, to the fungi that live in the soil. How do we preserve that? And how do we preserve the culture of wine? Because without people farming and living in Mendoza and being part of viticulture, we have no wine. And so maintaining that culture and some of these traditions that have made our wine what it is also really important.
You've just really summarized a lot of, what we're seeing in mainstream is, especially viticulture and even just mainstream agriculture, where people are realizing it's all about the community. It's all about sticking to those traditional methods. That is actually what makes good product if you're dealing with organic vegetables, fruits, etc. And I think the principles of, well, if we're going to make a wine and we want it to be true to ourselves, we need to make sure we're balancing heritage, but with that innovation. So you're using the innovation to make sure that you are leveraging everything that makes Argentina what it is. And that's a good way of actually paying it forward and paying homage to the country itself and the culture. So you're taking it back, isn't it? Do you think some of these principles come from, your core values and your ethics in growing up? Is that something that's been ingrained in you, do you think?
And I just want to make one comment about the elevation, that one of the things that we figured out with our research was that elevation wasn't just interesting because of the cooler climate. And, to make an age-worthy wine, you need good acidity. It can't be too hot. But also the effect of the sunlight was thickening the skins and giving us more tannin. So there's a lot of research that came out of this altitude research that was qualitative research and made our wines better. So to answer your question about why culture seemed so important, I think that in our family, always the ancestors were revered. People always talked about Nicola. My father would always tell stories about his Italian grandfather. And my grandfather still made prosciutto, and he would grow his own tomatoes. And he had this huge orchard that he would basically farm himself, no help, till very old age. And when you went to his house, he would feed you the produce that he had been growing. And, he was running a substantial winery, but he still took the time to have his own produce, and he would make his own prosciutto. And we also make our own olive oil that we only sell in Argentina because, we don't make that much. So there would be no sense in exporting it. But, keeping these traditions alive from your culture. And, our culture is this mix of Italian and Spanish, and there's some native traditions in Argentina that go into the food, like a lot of the cornmeal, and the soil and climate is not European. Even if we have these immigrants, the soil and climate is American. And my husband is from the U.S., and I always say, I am American in Argentina. You can't own that word, so I call it American to include all the Americas. And I think that the fact that my father, my mother also actually is an incredible cook. I am actually a terrible cook. Antola, I'm sorry to tell you this. We do have a Michelin-starred restaurant, but it has nothing to do with me, the cooking. I do participate a lot in the wine with the wine first concept that we're going to talk about later, but I am a terrible cook. My mother's a great cook, and she was always telling us, okay, I learned this recipe from, your grandmother, from our father's side, or from her Italian grandmother. We're all half Italian, half Spanish in my family. So I think that the fact that our family kept those traditions alive was part of why I thought that was so important. But I think also some of that did come from medicine, in the sense that medicine is a very collaborative field, especially emergency medicine. You cannot do anything without the team. There's the person doing the EKG, there's the nurses, there's, the medical students, there's the person who takes the information on the patient when they walk in. If that person doesn't figure out that somebody's sick, something bad could happen. So this idea that everything you do is about this community, and, hospitals have really strong communities that support each other. And so I think that sense of community that I had learned as a doctor also helped when it came to going to the winery and saying, there's this whole community behind this. And how do we support this community that involves not just the people at the winery, but everybody in Mendoza is supporting wine in a certain way? For example, this is an incredible thing, is that, we had mining that was potentially coming to our region. And, they didn't need to come to the areas where we were making wine or farming vineyards. They could have gone to other places. And they were literally about to put all these mines that, if something went wrong, could contaminate our water. And the people went out in the streets and they didn't get the rights for mining and things like that. If the culture is not defended by the people who live there, then who is going to defend it? And I think I grew up with this culture where everybody cares about wine and what wine means to our region. We are the wine region of Argentina. Mendoza is making 80% of the wine. So even if somebody doesn't work in wine, they care about wine and our traditions. And I grew up in that. And, I am trying to do that with my children also, to teach them how important the farming culture and all that. And I think it is hard for people who live in cities to have that connection to the land. And that is one of the things that I love about wine, is that when you drink a bottle of wine, today you can ChatGPT who the producer is. And, I love and hate ChatGPT, but when I'm drinking a wine and I just plug in the name and it tells me all about that family, I love it. And we can stay connected to all these places, to all these cultures through a bottle of wine. And that's beautiful.
And the whole thing about community and collaboration. And I think that's what makes the industry so interesting. One of the reasons I've also fallen in love with it is that it's really about, of course, yes, winemaking techniques, sustainability, ecosystem, etc., and great product, but it's really about the community, the people making the wine, the marketing, the people importing it, the ones who have to sell it. And then when you have sommeliers who then do the food pairings and things like that. So there's a whole industry behind it that has people that is so important, which is, missing, as when you live in a city. It's all about urbanization and it's sort of lost in a way. Now, going back, that's been a really interesting fun fact that you've shared, that you're not a great cook. And yet you have this Michelin star restaurant, which I need to visit when I come to Argentina. Angelica Cucina Maestra, which has got Michelin stars, and just like I've seen some footage about the food pairings and that whole concept of wine first. Was that restaurant your concept? Was it your idea then to say we actually need a restaurant in the family, or how did that come about?
Okay, so actually I vetoed the restaurant concept for 20 years. Everybody in my team would say, Laura, this winery just put a restaurant, that winery just put a restaurant. Why don't we have a restaurant? And I would say, you know what? It would be very arrogant for me to say that we're trying to make the best wines of South America, and that is our goal. We want to be up there with the best of the world. And, I'm a big believer in competition, not mean competition, but, saying, I want to improve and good. Look at my neighbor. They did this. Wow. We now need to make an even better wine. I think that's healthy. And we always talk like this with the other producers in Argentina. When we sit there and bring a bottle of wine, we do this all the time where everybody brings a bottle and we taste it and you're thinking like, oh my God, his wine is so good. Oh my God, her rosé is amazing. And that triggers you to work harder and say, wow, my competition is tough. There's so much good wine. And I'm a big believer that everybody in Argentina should be trying to make a better wine. And that, makes our region rise. But now back to the cooking and the Angélica Cocina Maestra. So I said, listen, everything needs to go into wine because it's already so hard to compete out there. There's so much good wine from all over the world. And if we get distracted with a restaurant, which is another really hard thing. I mean, I said, how arrogant would that be for us to say that because we make great wine, that we now can make great food? It's a completely different field. So I said, you know what? We don't have time for that. We barely have enough time to do all the wine projects we have. So how could we possibly do a restaurant? And so our winemaker, Alejandro Gil, who's been called the Messi of wine in Argentina, he started a restaurant at his house with his wife. His wife is actually a scientist. She is a biologist who specializes in tomatoes and onions in the genetic diversity. So she's another hardcore scientist. He's a soil specialist and winemaker. And he actually started in research before he became a winemaker. So they're this power science couple. And so they start this restaurant and their restaurant becomes the number one in Mendoza. Everybody wants to go there. It's the top restaurant. And so then he comes to me and he says, Laura, okay, so are you still thinking that you can't have this restaurant? I said, well, I guess you've just proven me completely wrong, that somebody like you exists because you are this, amazing winemaker and you've managed to have the top restaurant at your house. And so I said, okay, I give up because my father also was pushing for the restaurant. And so then during the pandemic, my father built that whole entrance area, I did want to have this front area because we have the pyramid is, sort of inland. And I wanted to have a place for people to come and have a wine tasting experience at the entrance of the winery area, because at the winery we're also working, so we can't have that many visitors. And so the pandemic happened and basically my father went crazy and he built this restaurant place and a distillery because the original winery in the site is an underground winery. Most wineries in the past were underground because that was the way to control temperature. Because they didn't have electricity. He built the coolest thing. My father should be an architect. You know how I'm a doctor and a wine person? My father actually should be an architect. He's an economist as well. He has a PhD in economics, but he loves building. And I like planting vineyards. I don't like building buildings. I only like nature, but he likes building buildings. And so he built this building inspired by an Italian photo I'd sent him years before. I sent him this little tower and he loved it so much. And it's built with these recycled bricks. So anyhow, the restaurant, Angélica Cocina Maestra, was built. And then our winemaker is running it with his wife and they hire the whole team. And he knows a lot about this because his restaurant also has a Michelin star. Actually, they got the star before Angélica. And so anyhow, that is why we have this great restaurants, because our winemaker and his wife run it and they are real experts in running restaurants. But the concept is wine first. And do you want me to tell you about the wine first concept?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So this was part of the so that was part of the negotiation. I said, okay, we will have a restaurant, but it will be a wine first restaurant. And what wine first means is that you start with the wine list and then the wine is the main course and the food is the pairing. And this seems like a simple difference, but it's a monumental difference because basically what we do is we create all these lists of wines the same way you would create a menu in a restaurant. So we have the roller coaster wine menu, which is my favorite, which is, you start with a red wine and then you go to 2 white wines and then you go back to a red wine, then you go to a sparkling. And you would be surprised, Ntola, about how much fun it is to break the rules of wine order. It's so much more interesting. And then we have one food menu, which is seasonal. And the food menu is one and only. So there's one menu. So the wine is your selection. So you can walk in and you can say, you know what? I want to do an all white menu. We have a no alcohol wine menu. So we have some products that we make, some mixes of must and verjuice. We have de-alcoholized products. So we have a no alcohol. If somebody doesn't want to drink, they can have the no alcohol pairing. And then we have, old vintage tasting, which is incredible, going, back into the 90s. And all these different wine menus, and then one food menu. And the food obviously is extraordinary because I'm not making it. It's this couple, Juan and Josefina, who make the food. And we have our orchard so that all the vegetables that go into the food are locally sourced right there. We have this really large, I think it's a whole hectare of produce that we grow right there. All obviously organic. And then, things like fish come from the local streams. So, everything is local and the food is amazing, but it's wine first.
I love that, isn't it? It's really a bold way of reimagining hospitality, that's sort of like inspiring experiential way of looking at pairing food, but also wine in terms of breaking the norm of you have to drink wines in this order and so on. And you have to do things differently, isn't it? Why, if you keep on doing the same old thing, then you get the same result. So it's sort of wine leads and the food is what follows with the concept.
And what I'm trying to get people to do, and we're actually doing this whole campaign around this, is to go into their cellar. And, most people who really love wine will have a little stash of wine somewhere. So you might have a fancy cellar, or you might have just a little location in your house where you keep your bottles. My kids don't have a wine cellar, but they have their little rack that I bought them where they keep some wines. And so when friends come over, depending on the occasion, they'll open one bottle or another. And so I encourage people to say, you know what? I don't have any time to cook today, but I'm going to open a special bottle of wine, or maybe two. And it doesn't mean you need to drink the two bottles. You can use different ways of storing wine. I always tell people, buy one of those little corks that you take out the oxygen. There's many different methods. So you can maybe open 3 or 4 bottles, but you're just going to have a little bit of each. So this is not just for fancy restaurants. You could do it at home. You can open 4 bottles, or you can have friends bring each a special bottle that they think of. And then you know what you can do today with all these apps that you can order stuff? You can have the wines there and say, okay, what food do we want for this? And then maybe you order 2 or 3 different plates. And then it's wine first because your friends brought the wine. And then you find some food to pair with the wine. And imagine the most amazing time you could have. And you would have spent very little time cooking. If you're like me, I'm so busy. I love to cook on weekends because, I want to go to get, local farmers market food and that kind of thing. But during the week, I do get a lot of takeout. But how much more fun would it be if you did something like this? And then, you don't have to spend the time cooking if you don't have it. On the other hand, I'm a big proponent of cooking at home. But, I think like many things, you preach something and you don't necessarily do it. So my kids always call me on it. They say, oh, you're always telling us not to eat this and that, and you're always getting takeout. And I say, you're right. But at least I have the fantasy that someday I will cook more.
Yeah, and the whole thing of bringing people together, a lot of people who live in major cities, it's having takeout and wine. If you can do it with friends or close people, if you are a drinker, then it's, it's a good way of saying, oh, let's actually try different wines that we bought with the food as well. And, promoting people not being behind screens, but actually trying to spend time together. And Laura, if it's takeout and wine that brings them together, then that's
very true.
another good way of looking at it.
And there's also takeout on takeout. There's some takeouts that are healthier than others. And, the current trend in medicine is not to tell people, don't do this, don't do that. Is more saying to people, do more of this good thing. We all get takeout food. That's not going away. If you live in the city, when I'm in Mendoza, a lot of the food does come from local farms, but that's not an option for everybody in the city. You're going to have to do a few days a week takeout. But then maybe you have a salad that you make, you have the main course, you get the takeout, and then you have dessert fruit that you got from a local market. So the current thinking in nutrition is, what are the things that are really healthy that you can do more of and do less of the less healthy things? But it's not telling people never, ever, have bacon. I mean, you can have bacon once a month. More than that is probably not a good idea. But what what can you substitute that moment with something else? So more fresh fruits and vegetables. But it's not about telling people, don't do this, don't do that, because then people stop listening. So this wine first, I think, really opens the door to have a gathering with friends, to have it be really special, and to be able to do it while you still have to do all your emails at night, so you might not have that much time to cook. So yeah.
And also you have an audience for any new wines that you bring out. You can actually see the reaction from the
Absolutely,
consumer, isn't
absolutely.
it? And get
Yeah,
that
yeah, yeah,
feedback, that
yeah.
insight, which sometimes you're waiting for it to be transported across the world or to get to the masses
Well,
before you have
absolutely.
that too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We do a lot of experimentation. So, for example, our low alcohol menu, we first tested it at the restaurant, and people loved it. You always get somebody that's either driving or they're pregnant or they can't drink wine, and they're all sad. They're sitting drinking sparkling water, and now they can have their own course. And actually, a lot of people bring their children to our restaurant. We have a little juice for them. We don't give them, I mean, even no alcohol wine. I guess, I don't know, actually, the no alcohol product we have with botanicals would be completely safe for a child, because it's basically grape juice and verjuice, which is grape juice with some botanicals. So they could have that. But generally, we don't give them that. We don't want them to think that it's okay to drink wine. But yeah, we do a lot of experimenting at the winery with different concepts and wines, because we have the opportunity to explain to people what they're drinking.
Let's talk about in defense of wine. So, you've talked about, I love how the doctor in you always comes out when you're talking about what's good, what's not. My sister's a doctor and she's always
Oh
everything
yeah,
in moderation. And I can feel those traits coming through. But your platform in defense of wine is obviously
yeah,
sharing evidence-based
yeah,
insights into wine and health.
yeah,
So what misconceptions are you hoping to challenge?
yeah,
And I guess, how does your medical
yeah.
background inform you with these
Yeah,
views?
absolutely. So, I kind of feel like I went to med school to be alive at this moment in the world, because we've been making wine for 6,000 years as humans, and we've been enjoying it. And it's been a big part of culture, of conviviality, of enjoying food more. It used to be something that people drank to not be poisoned by water. They would put a little, alcohol as a way to purify water. Now it's mostly a pleasure thing and something that helps us relax in moderation. And to see this anti-alcohol movement basically taking misinformation and spreading it on the internet, which is possible today. It wasn't so easy before the internet to have a, a concept that was a lie and spread it. Today, anybody can come up with something that's not true and spread it. And so this is what's happening. So there is information about alcohol and health based on these observational trials that are not as good as what's randomized controlled. Randomized controlled is, for example, you're trying to test paracetamol for headache, and you say, okay, here you are, my 1,000 people that get headaches. We're going to randomize. Some of you are going to take something that's a placebo, so it's not the paracetamol, and some are going to take paracetamol, and we're not going to tell you which is which, and you're going to say if your headache got better. And that's a randomized control. Observational is they basically look at thousands of people that fill out questionnaires, and they say, do you smoke? Do you not smoke? Are you diabetic or not? What's your weight? What's your socioeconomic status? Do you eat fruits and vegetables? Do you drink alcohol? How much do you drink? And then they look at all that data and they say, okay, there's this association between this behavior and this disease. And it's not as good as the randomized control trial to get hard information. But back to your question about what am I trying to do in defense of wine? I'm trying to put there the correct information about alcohol and health, because there is so much misinformation. And this misinformation is spreading because there's this new tool, social media, the internet, for spreading misinformation. And a lot of the mainstream media, for some reason, is printing misinformation. So, for example, something that's happening a lot is they quote some researcher, or sometimes even physicians, who are published in what I call low impact factor journals. So high impact factor is something like The Lancet. You've heard of The Lancet. The Lancet is a very high impact factor. The two leading medical journals in the world are Lancet and New England Journal of Medicine. Lancet is the European one. New England Journal of Medicine is the US one. If something's published there, you say, wow, this is a really good journal. And so some of these mainstream journalists are quoting somebody and highlighting an article in a very low impact factor. So Lancet has 96 as a number. Low impact factor would be 2. 2 is a lot less than 96. So somebody publishes in one of these low impact factor journals, that means that it's not really great research, because if the research was that great, they would have gotten it published in a better journal. So impact factor is a way to know, is this research really great? Or is it maybe just a theory? It's not well proven. Okay, but it is published. So they will publish and they will basically give all this credibility to something that is not published in the best journal, and they will put it as fact. Yet, meanwhile, there is a publication in one of the top journals contradicting what that says, and they don't publish that because they're not researchers. A real researcher would look at all the data and would say, okay, I'm going to give more importance, more credence to the better study, the one that had more people, that was conducted in a better way. So what is happening is that a lot of this bad research is getting a lot of attention because people are ideological. And if they're anti-alcohol and they get a pitch by an anti-alcohol researcher, they'd say, this is what I like to write about. And the other thing is that actually there's a lot of consumers that have become very passionate against alcohol. And so they also love reading those articles. So, if you're a publication, you want to get a lot of likes and a lot of reads. And when you say something, really bad, like, we're all going to die from, drinking beer, well, people read that because they're scared. That's what's happening right now. So the reason I created In Defense of Wine is to have really credible information from really good journals. And I also put my responses to some of these articles that are alarmist and incorrect. I put my responses there. But I am also not somebody saying anybody should drink anytime as much as you want. Obviously not. Excess drinking is very harmful. A lot of people die from alcohol. If you can't drink in moderation, you should consider not drinking. On the other hand, I also think it's an individual choice. As long as you're not drunk driving, if you want to drink too much, that's your issue. You're aware that it's not good for you. That's your choice. So I want to put the real science about this and then let people make their decisions. And that's my goal. And that's why I also give lectures about this. And, as a doctor in the emergency department, I learned to communicate very complex science in simple terms. And that's a skill set that's very helpful right now because, people don't want to hear all the details. They just want to know, hey, is it okay to have a glass of wine with dinner every night? And I can give them that information.
It's so interesting because what's actually happening is, fact checking and research is just becoming far more obsolete. It's evolving, isn't it? Information overload, AI generated content where you can't distinguish between fact or fiction. And, we need academic rigor. We need verification of that, but there are lots of shortcuts. And I think also that credibility gap is widening as there are not enough researchers. And they're relying more on secondary sources too. So the fact that you're saying, right, how I'm going to fight this is not by complaining, but actually putting correct information online so that when people are searching, they can see what's not fact, but also see the things that have been, verified, that have that research integrity and stopping the spread of misinformation.
And one thing I also want to say is that I always clarify that I have a conflict of interest. I am a wine producer. So when they read my stuff, they need to know that I think that people should continue to drink wine if they enjoy it and they're able to control how much they drink, because I think it's a beautiful thing in life. But yes, I am biased and I don't hide that. That's why I send them to articles that are published by people who have nothing to do with the alcohol industry as well. And that's an important thing. I actually did this interview in Ireland. In Ireland, they were going to put these back labels that to me were incorrect because they were saying that, all alcohol causes cancer and liver disease. And that's not true. Alcohol in moderation, should not cause liver disease if your liver is okay. The cancer risk, there may be some association with breast cancer with drinking even small amounts. But again, I tell people, go talk to your doctor. Every person has a bunch of risk factors, genetics. So your doctor needs to talk you through what's the best thing for you. If you wanted to have no risk for anything, everybody would be super thin. No one would ever have butter or, go out in the street. Actually, walking is risky, is more risky than drinking. This was this article that The Economist published. I was So funny because actually they looked at the data on people walking, and actually walking is more risky than drinking to your health, than drinking in moderation.
That is amazing.
And they
Yeah.
showed all the data. So anyhow, so the point being that I just wanted all that information to be in one place, and I have most of the references. All the references come from reputable publications. But I do have a big concern, which is that some of this anti-alcohol talk is now going to attack scientists. And you were saying that about how, it's hard to be a scientist. It's hard to get funding. And for a scientist that's trying to figure something out to be attacked because they said that there's some benefit. I mean, there's this huge US study from the National Academies, which is the most reputable group of doctors. That they basically get a group of doctors that are top in their field to answer a difficult question. This is something done by the US government. The US government commissioned this study from the National Academies, leading doctors. They showed that people who drink in moderation have about between 16 and 24% lower all-cause mortality. And they controlled for socioeconomic status, for weight, for all kinds of things. So that's kind of a powerful finding, right? And, people tried to smear that, this maybe had something to do with the alcohol industry. That has nothing to do with the alcohol industry, did not fund it. But people start saying it, and then the readers say, oh, well, maybe it's true, right? So this is the problem we have. You can't even do credible research and publish in a good journal without somebody who has a different motive, who just disagrees with you, trying to question it. And so, yeah, In Defense of Wine is everything that I think is credible in one website for people to understand what the risks and benefits might be to moderate drinking.
I mean, if anyone wants to see the truth of the study that was done, you should just go and see how people in Mediterranean climates live, whether it's in France or Italy. You have your nonna who's in her knees and so on, and she's been
Yeah.
been walking, drinking, and all of that. And you think it's the quality of life, isn't it? That
Yeah.
everything in
Yeah.
moderation, it
Yeah.
comes back down to that, I
Well,
suppose.
actually, I have slight objections to everything in moderation. I'll tell you in a minute. First, about Mediterranean diet. So every time they've studied different diets, the Mediterranean diet comes on top. And the Mediterranean diet includes alcohol in moderation. Now, there is a study going on right now in Spain, 10,000 people, randomized controlled. So the gold standard study where they're randomizing people to keep on drinking wine or to stop drinking wine. And they're going to check their hair to make sure that they're following the instructions. And after the study is finished in about 5 years, we're really going to know, is there a heart protective effect from alcohol, which mostly from wine, they will be able to say because they're only testing wine within the Mediterranean diet. So, the research for decades has shown this heart protective effect because alcohol is a blood thinner. It's like a little aspirin. And many people don't know they have heart disease. So if they're drinking in moderation, it's like taking an aspirin. So their heart is protected. There's also improvement in sugar levels, so lower sugar, so better sugar control with moderate drinking. And there's a whole mechanism for that. But anyhow, this study is going to definitively tell us, is there a heart protective effect from wine in the Mediterranean diet? Or could we get rid of the wine and the Mediterranean diet would still be good? So we're going to get an answer to that. But back to the everything in moderation. So that is actually not correct in my point of view, because there's some things that actually are really bad, even in moderation. So for example, smoking. So a lot of people smoke socially, right? So they have a cigarette with their friends, and 4 cigarettes per day, this has been studied, increase your mortality by 50%. That's really bad. So actually smoking a little is really bad. Whereas drinking a little reduces your mortality. You live longer. So what I'm saying is there's some things where you could say everything in moderation, and there's other things where a small amount has a high risk.
Yes.
So I actually think that everything in moderation does not necessarily apply, because what is moderation? So for example, we do know what are some amounts of, highly processed food that are harmful. They think that actually any amount, but, can anybody prove that, you have 1 hamburger per month from some fast food? Is that harmful? Probably not, right? So I do think there's a point about everything in moderation, but I think there's
Yeah,
some
it's
things
dangerous,
that,
isn't it? In terms of
yeah,
if you use it for the wrong things, then it
yeah.
becomes, like
I
smoking and so on. Yeah.
I think there's something that you should just try to never do. But again, if somebody wants to have their cigarette with their friends, as long as they're aware of what the risk is, that's their call. Like, as long as they're not harming somebody else or smoking inside their house, that's their.
Yeah, it's a lot of to be said about that, isn't it? Is making sure that people are aware of the consequences of their actions. And it's the awareness, isn't it, piece, which is, I mean, there's, like you said, there's misinformation and there's hardcore
Yeah.
information out there that is
Yeah.
telling you that. Let's pivot to talk about, you being an author and a storyteller. What inspired you to become an author?
Well, mostly I wanted somebody to talk about all these different things. And I was looking for somebody else to write a book about all these things that I thought somebody should write about. And it's not that easy to get somebody else to write about your idea unless you're willing to pay them a ton of money. And the first book was Vino Argentino, An Insider's Guide to the Wines and Wine Country of Argentina. There was not an English language book about Argentine wine. And I talked to so many journalists and they were like, oh, we're too busy. We can't write this book. And so I said, okay, I'm going to write this book. And I actually, after 5 years, found a publisher and they actually paid me to write the book. And it was a very successful book. And I think it really changed what people knew about Argentine wine. And the reviews are wonderful because a lot of people would buy it before going to Argentina on a wine trip. And it has recipes, which are amazing. And anyhow, that was a great book. And then the second book was Gold in the Vineyards. I wanted somebody to write a book about the great vineyards in the world, how they weren't all in Burgundy, that there were great vineyards in
Controversial,
Argentina,
yes.
Italy, in Australia, and in the US. And I wanted it to be illustrated because I think people don't want to be reading dense tomes about wine. And I love illustrated books. I love illustrations. I love children's books. I wish all my books now were children's books. And so we did an illustrated book. And then the last book was with our winemaker, Alejandro Gil, and it's Malbec Mon Amour. And it's our road trip through Malbec, the history of Malbec, Argentina. And it actually became a bestseller in Argentina. And it was the first time that a wine book was a bestseller. Yeah.
What story were you most passionate about telling? Which was your favorite book to write?
So, my sister is a historian, Adriana Catena. She has a PhD from Oxford. So I'm very proud of her. And she says my best book is Gold in the Vineyards, because that's the book where I tell the stories of the most famous vineyards in the world. And our vineyard is one of the vineyards, but, I have 4 French vineyards. So I was fair. I didn't, take everything for Argentina. But it's really fun because I looked at all the kind of, crazy, dramatic stories that happen in all these places. And I put these stories in the book. So it's actually a really fun book to read. And it has these great illustrations.
Let's talk about mentorship and leadership, because we know that a lot of women are looking for inspiration in their careers. Who are your key mentors and how are you now helping women, whether it's in science, winemaking, or business, or even just being an author?
Yeah, so everybody needs mentors. Mentors are so important. And I read a book a long time ago that said that you need older mentors and younger mentors. And that seems so simple, but that wasn't obvious to me. I was always thinking you need older mentors. And then I realized, wow, the young people know so much stuff that I don't know. And it's not just because science and culture move so fast. It's just that they have a different way of looking at the world because they're younger. And older people have also a different way of looking at the world. So I figured out I'm going to have mentors of all ages. The other thing that I figured out was that if we want more women to rise professionally, we actually need men to have older or more senior female mentors. Because what I started seeing in my team was that, men that were being mentored by women, men that had women as their boss, were much better mentors to new women workers because they were comfortable with female authority. And so instead of just saying, I'm going to mostly mentor women, I decided, you know what? I need to mentor a lot of men because, we just need people mentoring. And women need both male and female mentors. Men need male and female mentors. People need mentors of all kinds. You need mentors in art. You need mentors in science. You need mentors in business. You need mentors in how to live a good life. And I realized that the most important thing about mentoring was to be part of a diverse mentoring group. And I think of myself as a mentor and a mentee. And I have different relationships with different people. And in some relationships, I'm mentoring something about something and they're mentoring me about something else. So it's, collaborative mentoring. There isn't one person that's above the other one. And so what I would say to people is find your mentors, and there has to be a good fit. It's almost like a psychologist. They say that a psychologist cannot help you unless there's a personal good fit. And maybe this is obvious, but I think sometimes people get really obsessed about finding mentors because somebody tells them, hey, you need to find your mentors. And, the mentor relationship has to be fun also. And if you're asking somebody to mentor you, you kind of have to give them back something as well. So that is one thing that I have noticed sometimes is that organizations set up mentorship programs, and it's all about the mentor giving to the mentee. And people are really busy. So if somebody can help me in something, well, I'm much more likely to help them. I know maybe this sounds a
A
little
relationship, isn't it, at the
utilitarian,
end of
but
the day?
we're all really busy. So I really like it when somebody wants to be mentor, but when they say, well, I know about this one thing, I can help you with that. That's a mentorship relationship that I love, when I am the mentor and the mentee. That's my favorite kind of relationship. So I would encourage people to get into those kind of relationships as opposed to just saying, okay, this person's going to teach me. Actually, my daughter, who is in university, she has a great mentor who is one of her professors. And he said to her, well, what I expect in exchange is that when you are more advanced in your career, that you will do the same that I'm doing for you. That's what you could give me back. And this is somebody that cares so much about mentoring that they are looking for that. They want the mentee to commit to becoming a mentor to others. And that makes them whole. That means something because that person is trying to have a huge impact. That is their life goal, to affect a lot of people, to help a lot of people. And I thought that was really wonderful because,
I love
my
that.
daughter took it very seriously. She said, oh, I need to know, when am I going to look for mentees? I said, no, you're okay. You're still mostly looking for mentors.
Still
She's
got 15,
20.
20 years to go, to
Yeah,
pay it forward.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Laura, looking ahead, what's next for you? I mean, ahead 5, 10 years, what is your vision? What are you working on?
Well, we're always working at things in the winery. We're now planting vineyards outside of Mendoza because the water is limited because of the Andean glaciers and the climate change. So we are trying to elevate other regions outside of Mendoza, in Patagonia, in Salta, in La Rioja. We have a place called La Rioja in Argentina. So we're trying to find Grand Cru or like first growth level vineyards in some of these areas that are less known. And, Argentina is a huge country with very few people. So there are these incredible locations at high altitude that I think could make incredible wine. So that's one really interesting project. We're working on these low alcohol wines, but we want these wines to taste as good as alcohol wines. I think that's virtually impossible, but closer than what they are now, what the market looks like. We also are working on some white wine projects. There is an increase in white wine interest, and we are very well known for our high altitude Chardonnay, but we have a lot of Chenin Blanc planted in Argentina. We have a wine that's relatively new, last couple of years, Sauvignon Chenin blend that is selling really well, and really working on preserving what we already have, which is so special. And with climate change, there are a lot of challenges. One really important thing is keeping people working in vineyards. It's really hard to stop the exodus to the city. And it's not just financial. It's just, people are moving to the cities. This is a worldwide phenomenon. So how can we make the lives of people working in the vineyards so amazing that they want to stay? And so I'd say that that's one of the bigger projects. But yeah, there's so much stuff going on. And actually, this fighting misinformation about alcohol and health, I would say, is one of my most important projects because it's kind of existential. This is a cultural product and it's been around for 6,000 years. And I think it's very cavalier for people to just say, oh, bye-bye to this beautiful cultural product that is most likely health enhancing rather than health negative in moderation. So I think that that's kind of a big part of what I'm looking to do in the next couple of decades, is make sure that the true science is being shared with people who love wine.
Look, I think your legacy is already on track. AI is not going to take away, vineyards and farming and community. So I think there's a lot there. Laura, before we close, we always ask our guests to share their Trailblazer takeaway tips, one or two pieces of advice for the listeners to take away with them. What would they be?
Well, the first one is a phrase that somebody, an ex-ice hockey player that became a doctor. He said, hard on issues, soft on people. That is the best phrase because sometimes people feel, oh, God, was I too hard on that person? Well, you should never be hard on a person, but you should be hard on issues. You should really fight for the issues that matter. And so I think that's just sort of a communication guideline that is so helpful for people who are very passionate like me and who tend to sometimes speak too loud or too strongly. I always remember that. Never be hard on people. And if you are, just apologize right away. You must apologize. It's never good to leave somebody sad or feeling bad about themselves. So that's really important. And another one that might actually surprise you, because I was talking about how when I started, I was all about, I don't care about money and, I want to help people, is actually to be very aware of how much things cost. And when I started working with my father, he has a PhD in economics, and he basically said, hey, I need so much help from you. Go do the research, travel around. He didn't like traveling to sell wines. From now on, I'm not traveling. You do all the traveling. And, I was traveling all over the world. And, I didn't really know, how many bottles do I need to sell to justify a trip to Japan, and I think that in business, you really need to understand the money because it's very easy to dream and to have ideas. There's always a lot of ideas, but then can you pay for them? And to have really good people working for you, you need to pay them well. That requires a lot of money. So to be always conscious of how much it costs to do things. And that's something that I wish I'd done more at the beginning. And, I didn't because my father is a specialist in money. He's an economist. And I would recommend to everybody, you don't need to be an economist to understand money. It's basic arithmetic, and so be aware of how much things cost. That would be my other advice.
Dr. Laura Catena, thank you so much for your insight, your storytelling, your legacy. I think there definitely needs to be a part 2 of this for us to delve more. To the audience, please explore the catenainstitute.com, Catena Zapata on Instagram, In Defense of Wine. There is so much, and I'll put all the links in the bio.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time and telling your story.
Thank you. Yeah, my Instagram is Laura Catena MD, at Laura Catena MD.
Amazing.
Okay, all right.
Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.